Hi friends, welcome back to Family Shadows. Here we share stories that live in the quiet corners of family life, stories of respect, love, and sometimes justice that arrives not with a shout, but with a whisper. If you're new here, I invite you to subscribe so you don't miss the next story that might feel a little too close to your own. And if you've been with us for a while, thank you. Your support reminds us that family stories, though often painful, are never wasted. They carry the lessons that keep us going. Now, let's begin today's story. I inherited a wooden house. My daughter-in-law mocked me, but she forgot who holds the deed. George Walker was 62 when the letter came. It was the kind of letter people don't send anymore. Thick paper folded carefully in an envelope with his name written in a shaky, almost calligraphic hand. The lawyer in town had mailed it after the funeral, but George had not opened it until weeks later. Perhaps it was fear. Perhaps it was the weight of what it might contain. Or perhaps, as men his age often do, he simply didn't want to face what time had taken from him. When he finally slid it open, he sat at his kitchen table, a table that had long since lost its varnish from years of Sunday breakfasts, spilled coffee, and elbows pressed into stories, and he read, "To my son, George, I leave the house on Timber Lane, the wooden home built with my own hands." George let the paper rest on the table, his fingers lingering on the grain of the wood beneath it. A wooden house. His father's house. Now, if you've never grown up in a place where wood creaks under your feet and walls whisper when the wind runs through the cracks, you may not understand what that means. To some, it is only lumber nailed together. To others, it is a relic of poverty. But to George, it was memory. It was childhood. It was the echo of his father's laughter, the sternness of his mother's voice, the Saturday mornings with a hammer in hand, learning how to fix what could not be bought new. He drove there the next morning. Timber Lane hadn't changed much, though the town around it had. The coffee shop at the corner was now a yoga studio. The gas station was a wine bar. But Timber Lane still smelled of pine, and the house, tired, weathered, and sagging at the porch, stood waiting. When he stepped inside, dust rose like ghosts. The air was thick with cedar and age. A chair rocked faintly in the corner, though no one sat in it. The floors groaned like they were welcoming him back. George's hand brushed the door frame where his father had carved his height and his brother's, year after year. Those notches were older than most of the people still living in town. George smiled faintly, though it wasn't joy, it was reverence. "Hello, Dad," he whispered as if the walls could hear him. George wasn't alone in life, of course. His son, Michael, was 34, living with his wife Samantha and their little girl Lily not too far away. Michael was ambitious in the way only younger men can be, restless, chasing a better car, a bigger house, a title at work that proved something. He loved his father, yes, but he also pitied him sometimes, for still fixing things instead of buying new, for wearing the same coat winter after winter, for not knowing what equity really meant in modern conversations. Samantha was sharper. She had eyes that scanned a room and found its weaknesses. Where Michael might sigh and move on, Samantha would comment. She loved fine restaurants, smart clothes, vacations she could post about. To her, the wooden house was not heritage, it was humiliation. She had grown up in a city condo with polished floors and clean lines. A sagging porch and a draft in the window were not charming to her. They were embarrassing. And Lily, dear Lily, only 10 years old, saw the world the way children do, as a place of wonder. She loved her grandpa's stories, his calloused hands, and the way he let her paint pictures on scrap wood with leftover brushes. To her, the house on Timber Lane was not a ruin. It was a castle waiting to be lived in. When George told his family about the inheritance, they came along to see it. He could still hear Samantha's laugh echoing in the hallway as she stepped through the crooked doorframe. "Well," she said, brushing her designer jacket, "it suits you, George. Old house for an old man, just perfect." Michael gave a small laugh too, though less cruel, more nervous. He didn't want to offend, but he also didn't want to defend. Men like Michael often float between their father's dignity and their wife's approval, never quite sure where to land. George didn't answer. He simply walked to the fireplace, placed his hand on the mantel, and remembered how his father had built it brick by brick. Silence can speak louder than anger, and George let silence answer for him. Lily, however, ran through the rooms with delight. "Grandpa," she cried, "there's a window seat here. Can I read books there? And look, the stairs squeak, but it sounds like music." George knelt beside her, smiling. "Yes, Lily, it's yours as much as mine." That night, alone again in the wooden house, George sat on the porch. The stars above Timber Lane hadn't changed either. They still blinked the way his father once told him they did, like lamps guiding lost travelers home. He knew what Samantha thought. He knew what Michael feared admitting. To them, this was a burden. To him, it was a blessing. And blessings, he thought, are often mocked by those who cannot see beyond the surface. Inside, the house groaned again. But George didn't hear decay, he heard endurance. And so, the first chapter of this story is not about argument or confrontation. It is about inheritance, not of property, but of strength. For George, stepping into that wooden house was stepping back into his father's shoes. And as any man who has ever worn his father's shoes will tell you, they may not always fit, but they always lead you where you're meant to go. The following Sunday, George found himself at Michael and Samantha's dining table. They had insisted he come, though George suspected the invitation had more to do with appearances than with genuine care. Samantha liked hosting. It gave her a chance to set her polished silverware, to light the scented candles, to serve dishes she could photograph for her online friends. The house they lived in was new, all sharp corners and spotless glass. The air smelled faintly of lemon polish, too clean, too distant from the scent of wood and dust that George had come to trust. He sat at the far end of the long table, napkin folded neatly in his lap, and listened to the rhythm of his son's household. Michael passed the roasted chicken, asked Lily about school, nodded politely at Samantha's story about her yoga instructor. He looked tired, as young men chasing promotions often do, his tie loosened even on a Sunday. Samantha, though, had an energy in her voice that evening, a spark George had come to recognize. It was the sound of someone winding toward a point they wanted to make. "So, George," she said suddenly, her fork resting against the edge of her plate. "How's life in the cabin?" She drew out the word as if it were a punchline. "Still holding up, or is it collapsing already?" Michael coughed, looked down at his plate. Lily froze, her small hand still gripping a roll of bread. George lifted his eyes slowly. He did not rush, he never had. Time had taught him that silence often unsettled people more than quick retorts. "It's standing strong," he said finally, his voice even, "stronger than most places I've seen." Samantha laughed lightly, though it had no warmth. "Oh, I'm sure, but don't you think it's impractical? I mean, in this day and age. Drafty, creaky floors, no insulation. It's almost quaint." She tilted her glass of wine, swirling it as though the liquid held her reflection. "I told Michael it's the kind of place that belongs in an old photograph, not real life." Michael sighed, tried to change the subject. Dad, what she means is, maybe it's too much for you alone. You've got to think about the upkeep. You don't want to get stuck fixing things all the time. George's fork paused halfway to his mouth. He set it down, folded his hands, and looked at his son. Your grandfather built that house with his hands. Every board, every joint. He didn't have much, but he made something solid. That kind of strength doesn't disappear because the paint peels. Lily's eyes widened. She loved when her grandfather spoke about Grandpa Walker, the man she had never met but often imagined. To her, those words painted pictures more vivid than any photograph. Samantha leaned back, unimpressed. Yes, but times are different now. We don't live in the woods anymore, George. People invest. They build new. They don't cling to, well, relics. She smiled tightly, her words sugar on the outside, vinegar beneath. Don't you think it would be wiser to sell? Maybe put the money into something useful like Lily's education or a bigger house for us. That way it benefits everyone, not just, she waved her hand vaguely. Nostalgia. George's jaw tightened, but he didn't answer right away. He watched Lily lower her eyes as though embarrassed by her mother's words. He watched Michael fidget with his knife, torn between defending his father and keeping peace with his wife. When George finally spoke, his voice was low. That house isn't a relic, it's a story, and stories don't lose value just because someone doesn't see it. The table grew quiet except for the ticking of the clock in the hallway. Samantha broke the silence, her tone sharper this time. Well, stories don't pay bills. Let's be practical, George. You're retired. You don't need the stress. Hand it over, let us handle things. We know what to do with property. We can make it work for us instead of letting it rot. Michael shifted uncomfortably. She's just thinking ahead, Dad. You don't have to decide now, just think about it. George reached for his glass of water, his hand steady despite the weight pressing against his chest. He took a sip, set it down carefully, and turned his gaze to Lily. What do you think of the house, sweetheart? He asked softly. Lily hesitated, glancing nervously at her mother. Then she whispered, I think it feels like home, Grandpa. I like the creaky stairs. They sound like the house is talking. George smiled faintly, though his heart ached at her bravery. Out of the mouths of children, truth often slips unnoticed. Samantha rolled her eyes. Well, that settles it. If a 10-year-old thinks it's perfect, then I guess we're all wrong. Her sarcasm sliced through the air like a cold draft. George didn't argue, he didn't defend. He simply picked up his fork again and finished his meal in silence, each bite a reminder that words could wound more deeply than hunger ever could. But deep inside, he made a quiet promise to himself. He would not let Samantha's laughter nor Michael's hesitations erase what his father had left him. The house was more than wood and nails. It was dignity. And dignity, once surrendered, is not easily reclaimed. That night, George drove back to Timber Lane. The headlights cut through the quiet country road, illuminating stretches of pine that bent under the weight of autumn wind. The wooden house appeared at the end of the lane, a shadow against the moon, waiting as if it had been holding its breath for him all along. He parked the truck and sat for a moment, listening to the ticking of the engine cooling. Inside the cab, the silence grew heavier with each passing second, carrying the echoes of Samantha's laughter. Old house for an old man, just perfect. The words clung to him like burrs caught in wool. George stepped out, his boots crunching on the gravel. The porch creaked under his weight, but it did not collapse as she had so cruelly implied. It stood firm like it always had. He pushed open the door and inhaled deeply. Dust, cedar, faint mildew, yet to George it was the scent of homecoming. The house whispered. It always did. When the wind brushed through the eaves, the walls shifted and groaned. To most, it sounded tired. To George, it was a lullaby. He lit a single lamp in the living room and lowered himself into his father's chair. The cushion sagged. The wood beneath had worn smooth from decades of use, but it cradled him like an embrace. Closing his eyes, he could almost hear his father clearing his throat, the low hum before a story began. "Wood talks, Georgie," his father used to say. "If you listen close, it'll tell you what it needs. A loose board will complain. A proud beam will sing. Wood remembers everything that touches it." George opened his eyes, staring at the floorboards. They bore the scuffs of boots, the scratches of chairs, the faint stains of spilled cider from Christmases long gone. His childhood played out across those boards like a film strip. He remembered his mother kneeling on the rug, sewing patches onto his brother's trousers by lamplight. He remembered winter nights when the fire crackled and the wind howled against the windows, but inside, the warmth was thick as a blanket. He remembered his father teaching him to plane wood, the shavings curling like ribbons across the floor. A lump rose in his throat. Those days were gone. His parents were gone. His brother was gone, but the wood remained. The house had carried it all, stored every laugh, every scolding, every prayer whispered before bed. George rose and wandered through the rooms. His fingers traced along door frames where pencil marks showed how tall he and his brother had grown. Faded, almost invisible now, but still there, proof of boyhood carved into wood. He opened the old storage chest near the stairs. Inside, a jumble of forgotten relics, a fishing rod with the line tangled, a quilt his mother had half finished, a shoebox of postcards his father had collected from towns he never had the money to visit. George sifted through them slowly, reverently like a priest turning pages of scripture. At the very bottom lay a box he had never seen before. Small, plain, its wood darker than the rest. He lifted it carefully. The lid creaked as though reluctant to give up its secrets. Inside were papers, yellowed, brittle at the edges. Deeds, tax receipts, maps. His father's handwriting scrawled across margins. Careful notes, reminders, numbers only he would understand. George leafed through them, his heart quickening. One document bore an embossed seal. He held it closer to the lamplight. It was a property deed, not just for the wooden house, but for acres of land stretching far beyond the tree line. 50 acres at least, timber rights, mineral rights. His father had owned more than a house. He had owned the ground beneath their very feet. George sank back on his heels, the papers trembling in his hands. He remembered his father's silence when neighbors bragged of investments, vacations, bank accounts. He remembered the way his father would only smile and say, "Wood holds value longer than gold if you know how to see it." Now George understood. His father had left him more than walls and memories. He had left him power. Not the kind that shouts, but the kind that waits, patient and immovable. For a long while, George sat in the dim glow, staring at the deed. He thought of Samantha's words, the mocking tilt of her voice, the dismissive curl of her lips. He thought of Michael's unease, his son's inability to stand firm between loyalty and marriage. And he thought of Lily, with her wide eyes and innocent wonder, the only one who seemed to hear the house the way he did. George placed the documents back in the box, closed the lid, and slid it beneath the chest. He would not reveal it yet. Timing mattered. Let them laugh. Let them think him a relic. Quiet strength was more enduring than loud bravado. He rose, returned to the living room, and pressed his hand against the wall. The wood was cool under his palm. "You kept the secret well, old friend," he whispered, "and I'll keep it until the right moment." Outside, the wind rattled the windows, but inside, George felt steadier than he had in years. The house did not need defending. It had already proven its worth. The night stretched on, filled with whispers of memory and promise. George sat in silence, listening to the wood breathe, and for the first time since the inheritance, he felt not burdened but blessed. The following week, George received a call from Michael. His son's voice carried that careful tone, half casual, half deliberate, that children use when they are about to ask something of their parents. "Dad," Michael began, "are you free tonight? Sam and I thought we could come by. See the place again, talk about some things." George knew what some things meant. He said yes anyway. By the time their SUV pulled into the gravel drive, the sun was already sinking behind the trees, casting long shadows across the porch. Samantha stepped out first, her heels clicking against the uneven boards. She wrinkled her nose as if the air itself were unworthy of her perfume. Michael followed, a briefcase in hand, his shoulders tight. Inside, the wooden house seemed smaller with them in it. Samantha perched on the sofa, crossing her legs, while Michael laid the briefcase on the coffee table and opened it. Papers spilled out, charts, proposals, lists of numbers. "Dad," Michael said carefully, "we've been thinking. This house, it's got potential. Sure, it's old, but the land, it could be something. Sam's been talking to a developer she knows from her firm. They could buy it off you, maybe even partner with us. We'd turn the place into something valuable." Samantha leaned forward, her smile thin as glass. "Exactly. Imagine a modern retreat, vacation rentals, a spa even. People pay for rustic experiences these days, but they want them polished. With your signature, we could start the process, and you wouldn't have to worry about a thing." George said nothing. He leaned back in his father's chair, fingers laced together, and listened to the way her words dripped like honey over steel. Michael shuffled through the papers. "Look, Dad, we've run some numbers. With the land value, we could easily get 6 figures, maybe more. We'd invest it wisely. It wouldn't just sit here deteriorating. You could move into something easier, closer to us, maybe. No more repairs, no more drafts, no more headaches." George studied his son's face. Michael wasn't cruel like Samantha, but he was tired. Tired of striving, tired of bills, tired of proving himself. George recognized that weariness because he'd worn it once too long ago, when raising Michael and his brother had felt like hauling stones uphill every day. Samantha broke the silence. "George, you're a practical man, aren't you? You don't strike me as the sentimental type. I mean, what's the point of clinging to these walls? They'll rot. But money, that's useful. For you, for Michael, for Lily." George's eyes flickered at his granddaughter's name. "And what would Lily think," he asked softly, "when the house she calls home in her heart is gone? What story will she hold onto when she's older? A spa brochure?" Samantha's lips tightened. "Lily's a child. She'll outgrow fairy tales. She needs security, not creaky stairs." Michael looked away, his throat tightening. "Dad, she's not wrong. Times are different now. We need to think about the future." George rose slowly, walking to the window, where the last light of day slipped through the trees. He remembered his father standing in that same spot decades ago, arms crossed, saying in his gravelly voice, "Land doesn't vanish, Georgie. It waits. It grows. It gives back more than you put in if you respect it." He turned back to his son and daughter-in-law. "You speak of potential, of money, of ease. But do you know what ease costs? It costs memory. It costs roots. Once you trade those away, you'll never buy them back." Michael's jaw clenched. "Dad, you're making this harder than it needs to be. We're just asking you to sign. It's a practical choice." George met his son's gaze. "No, Michael, you're asking me to erase your grandfather's work, your grandmother's prayers, and every night of my boyhood spent under this roof. And that's not a signature I give lightly." The room fell quiet. Samantha shifted in her seat, irritation flashing in her eyes. "So you'd rather sit here alone, clinging to ghosts, than give your family a chance to thrive?" George's voice was calm, but beneath it ran the steady current of a river that had carved stone for centuries. "I'd rather sit with ghosts who built than with living souls who mock. This house will stand, and so will I." Michael closed the briefcase with a snap. He didn't argue further, but the weight in the room told George this was not the end. Pressure, once applied, rarely relents. It only waits, tightening with time. Outside, the wind rose through the pines, rattling the old windows as if the house itself was whispering agreement. The tension from that evening did not vanish. It lingered in the air between George and his son's household like a storm cloud that refused to break. Days passed, then weeks, and though Michael's voice on the phone was careful, measured, Samantha's presence sharpened every silence. One Friday night, George received another invitation. "Come over for dinner," Michael said. "A few of Sam's friends will be here. They'd love to meet you." George hesitated. He could already imagine Samantha's polished living room filled with chatter and wine glasses, the smell of food prepared not with love but with presentation in mind. Still, he agreed. A father's instinct is to stay close, even when the ground feels cold beneath his feet. When he arrived, the house was buzzing. Laughter spilled from the doorway. Samantha's friends, young professionals, dressed in sleek clothes that shimmered under the pendant lights, clustered in groups, sipping their drinks. Their voices were bright, animated, brimming with the kind of confidence that often comes from never having been truly tested by life. Michael greeted him with a half-hug, pulling him in quickly, before slipping away to refill glasses. George stood awkwardly for a moment, adjusting the collar of his worn flannel shirt until he noticed Lily running up to him. She threw her arms around his waist. "Grandpa, you came." Her joy eased his unease. He kissed the top of her head, grateful for her small anchor. Samantha's voice cut across the room. "Everyone, this is George, Michael's father." She motioned with her glass. He just inherited a wooden house, out on Timber Lane. The pause before wooden carried more meaning than the word itself. One of her friends, a man with a tie loosened around his neck, chuckled. "A wooden house, like a cabin." "Exactly," Samantha said, her lips curving. "Straight out of the last century, drafty, creaky, probably haunted." Laughter bubbled from the group. George felt the heat rise in his chest, but he didn't speak. He had learned long ago that sometimes silence is more dignified than defense. Samantha leaned closer to her friends, but loud enough for the room to hear. "It suits him, though, doesn't it? Old house, old man, perfect fit." The laughter grew louder this time, sharper. Michael shifted uncomfortably, forcing a smile as if to smooth the edges, but he did not stop her. His silence to George hurt more than the words themselves. Lily tugged at her grandfather's sleeve. "Grandpa," she whispered, "they don't understand." Her eyes shone with worry, her small hands trembling. George bent down, pressing his palm against hers. "It's all right, Lily," he murmured. "Sometimes people laugh at what they don't know how to value." Still, the words cut deep. Each chuckle felt like a hammer against the walls of the wooden house, each smirk a nail pried loose from its frame. Samantha, basking in the laughter, sipped her wine as though she had just told the cleverest joke of the night. Later, as dinner was served, George sat quietly at the end of the table. The candles flickered, reflecting in polished glasses and shiny plates. Conversations buzzed around him, but his mind drifted back to Timber Lane. He pictured the house standing alone under the stars, unbothered by laughter, unchanged by opinion. The wood had endured storms, winters, decades of wear. It had stood longer than any of the people now mocking it. Samantha's voice pulled him back. "George, you should bring some photos of the place next time. My friends would love to see it." She laughed again, this time openly. If only to prove it hasn't fallen apart yet. Her friends chuckled obediently. Michael lowered his gaze, slicing into his food with too much force. George placed his fork down slowly. He looked at his son, then at his daughter-in-law, and finally at the strangers around the table. His voice, when it came, was soft, almost tender, yet it silenced the room. "You all see wood as weakness," he said. "But wood, good wood, outlasts steel. It bends without breaking. It remembers every hand that touched it, every storm it survived. You laugh now. One day when the shine fades from your glass walls, you'll wish you had something that creaked and groaned but never gave way." The table fell still. A candle flickered. Samantha's smile faltered, her friends exchanging uncertain glances. George picked up his fork again, unhurried, as if nothing more needed to be said. But inside, something shifted. The ridicule had carved itself deep into him, yes. Yet beneath the sting, a fire began to glow. A quiet fire, steady and patient, waiting for the moment to show them all what would, and the man who guarded it was truly worth. The night after the dinner, George returned to Timber Lane later than usual. The drive felt longer this time, weighed down by Samantha's laughter still echoing in his ears. Words have a way of sticking, not just in the mind but in the body. They sat heavy on his shoulders, pressed against his chest. When he pushed open the door of the wooden house, the air felt different, cooler, sharper, almost as though the house itself knew what had happened. The boards groaned under his boots, but the sound no longer comforted him. It reminded him of a body sighing, tired from carrying too much. George set his coat aside and lit the old lamp again. Shadows danced along the walls, stretching over the carved notches on the doorframe, the scuffed floor, the mantel where his father's hands had once rested. He lowered himself into the chair, but tonight it didn't embrace him. Tonight it felt like a witness, waiting for him to make a choice. For a long while, George sat in silence, staring at the walls. Then slowly, he rose and went to the chest by the stairs, the one where he'd found the small wooden box weeks earlier. His hands moved with a steadiness that came from years of labor. He pulled the box out, placed it on the table, and opened the lid. Inside, the papers still smelled faintly of cedar and ink. His father's handwriting crawled across the margins like vines, careful and deliberate. George laid them out one by one, tax records, receipts, survey maps, and finally the deed. He traced the embossed seal with his thumb, the raised impression catching the lamplight. 50 acres, more than he had ever realized. The wooden house was not a shack perched on dying land. It was the gateway to something enduring. His father had been no fool. Quiet, yes. Humble, yes, but never a fool. George leaned back and exhaled. He could almost hear his father's voice again. "Don't measure worth by shine, Georgie. Measure it by what endures." He spent hours going through the documents, organizing them, making notes of his own in a clean notebook. His years of working with numbers, balancing checkbooks, stretching paychecks, had not left him. Methodically, he began to piece together the truth his father had hidden in plain sight. The property was valuable not just for the land but for the timber rights, for the mineral survey tucked between the papers, even for the water source that cut across the northern edge. Every page revealed more than Samantha could ever mock, more than Michael could ever dismiss. At one point, George pushed back from the table and laughed softly, a sound almost foreign after so many heavy weeks. "You clever old man," he whispered. "You knew all along." He rose and walked through the house, the papers still spread out like treasure maps. His hand brushed the walls, the beams, the banister polished by decades of palms sliding down it. All of it was tied to the land, bound by law, preserved by foresight. He imagined Samantha's smirk when she had told her friends, "Old house for an old man." He imagined the laughter, the pity, and he pictured the look that would spread across her face when she learned the truth, that what she had dismissed as relic was, in fact, an inheritance of power. But George was not a man for loud confrontations. He would not storm into their house with documents and accusations. No, his father had taught him patience. Wood bends, it waits, it holds. He would wait for the moment when silence broke louder than shouting. In the meantime, he prepared. He made copies of the papers. He placed the originals in a folder, then tucked them into the bottom drawer of an old desk, beneath stacks of letters and books. He locked the drawer and slipped the key into his pocket. Then he sat at the table once more, staring at the lamplight flickering against the deed. His mind wandered to Lily. She was the only one who looked at the house and saw magic instead of burden. He wanted her to know, not now, not while she was still young, but one day, that this house was more than wood. It was legacy. George began drafting a letter. His handwriting was slow, deliberate, just like his father's. He wrote not for Michael, not for Samantha, but for Lily. He told her about her great-grandfather, about the nights they had spent building, repairing, believing in the endurance of simple things. He told her about the land, about how it should be respected, not sold off to the highest bidder. The words poured quietly, steady as the house itself. He folded the letter, placed it inside an envelope, and wrote her name across the front. Then he slipped it into the wooden box with the deeds. By the time George extinguished the lamp, the stars were bright above Timber Lane. He lay in bed, the old springs creaking beneath him, but his heart was lighter than it had been in weeks. For the first time since Samantha's laughter had stung him, he no longer felt mocked. He felt ready. And somewhere deep in the night, as the house shifted and whispered, George understood. Storms don't destroy wood that has been seasoned by time. They only prove which beams can bear the weight. It was a Saturday evening when Michael called again. His voice was cautious, like a man treading on thin ice. "Dad, come to dinner tomorrow. Sam made reservations for a special meal at home. Just us. We should talk." George knew what talk meant. He had felt it building, like a vise tightening with each conversation. Still, he agreed. Some truths are best spoken at a table, with eyes meeting across plates and glasses, not shouted down a phone line. The next evening, George walked into their house with a folder tucked under his arm. The air smelled of roasted lamb and rosemary. The table was set with polished plates, the silver catching the light. Samantha moved gracefully between the kitchen and dining room, her heels clicking against the tile, her smile too rehearsed. "George," she said brightly, "so glad you could make it. Sit, sit." Michael poured wine into glasses, his jaw stiff. Lily darted in from the hallway, hugging her grandfather tightly around the waist. Her innocence was the only untainted thing in that house. As they sat, the meal began politely enough. Conversation about Lily's schoolwork, about Michael's projects at the office, about the weather. But it never lasts long, not when hidden intentions crowd the air. Samantha was the first to turn the key. She set her glass down and leaned forward, her voice sweetened but her eyes sharp. "George, we've been patient, but you can't ignore reality forever. That wooden house, it's falling apart. You don't belong rattling around in it. Let us take care of it. Sign the papers. Move into something easier. It's what makes sense." Michael cleared his throat, trying to soften her edge. "Dad, she just means it would be better for everyone. Less stress for you, more opportunities for us. We'd handle it responsibly." George said nothing, only cut into the lamb with slow precision. Samantha, emboldened by silence, pressed further. "Honestly, George, it's not even a home anymore, it's a coffin with windows. That shack belongs in a museum of poverty, not as a legacy. It suits you, though. Old house, old man, perfect match." Her words struck like a hammer. Even Lily looked up sharply, eyes wide with confusion and hurt. Michael winced but did not correct his wife. George set his fork down. For a moment he simply looked at them, his son caught between ambition and cowardice, his daughter-in-law cruel in her certainty, his granddaughter innocent and trembling at the sharpness she could not yet name. Then, without a word, he reached for the folder he had brought. Slowly, deliberately, he opened it and pulled out the deed. The paper caught the light, its seal glimmering faintly. He laid it on the table between the wine glasses and the plates. Samantha blinked. "What's this?" George's voice was calm, steady, like the groan of an oak tree in the wind. "This is the house you mock. This is the land you dismiss. Not just the house, but 50 acres of forest, water and soil, timber rights, mineral rights, every inch under my name alone. Your coffin is a cornerstone." Michael froze, his knife suspended in midair. 50 acres. George nodded. "Your grandfather left it. He worked, he saved, he planned. He didn't brag, he didn't boast, but he built something that would outlast him. And now it outlasts your laughter too." Samantha's face paled, though she tried to keep her composure. "But surely you don't mean to keep it all. You don't need." George raised a hand, silencing her. "Need is not the measure of worth. Respect is. And you, Samantha, have shown none. You mock what you don't understand. You want to strip for profit what was built for endurance. That is not stewardship, that is greed." The room was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. Michael's lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. He looked at the deed, at his father, at his wife, torn in ways words could not untangle. George leaned back in his chair, his eyes firm. "I will not sign. I will not hand over what was entrusted to me. This house, this land, will remain in Walker hands, but only for those who treat it with reverence. When the time comes, Lily will understand. Until then, it stays with me." Lily's small hand slipped into his under the table, squeezing gently. Her eyes shone with relief. George patted her hand, then lifted his gaze back to Samantha and Michael. His voice softened, but his words carried steel. "You wanted a signature. Here is mine, etched not in ink, but in the beams and boards of that house. You'll see it every time you drive past Timber Lane and realize it still stands, stronger than your mockery." No one spoke after that. The rest of the meal was eaten in silence. The lamb cooled on plates. The candles sputtered low. George gathered the folder, tucked the deed back inside, and rose from the table. He kissed Lily on the forehead and left without another word. Behind him, the house felt colder than ever. But ahead, down Timber Lane, the wooden house waited, its silhouette proud against the night sky, as though it too had just spoken its truth. The night after the dinner, George sat on the porch of the wooden house. The moon hung low, spilling silver across the roof, while the trees whispered in the breeze like old friends trading secrets. The weight of the confrontation still pressed on him, but beneath it was a strange lightness. as though truth, once spoken aloud, had cleared the air like a storm passing through. The creak of the porch steps startled him, and then came a small voice. "Grandpa." It was Lily, her pajamas peeking out from under a coat too big for her. Michael must have dropped her off on his way home, perhaps to smooth the edges of the evening, or perhaps Lily had begged to come. Either way, George opened his arms and she climbed onto his lap, curling against him like she had when she was little. For a long while they sat in silence, listening to the night. Finally, Lily looked up. "Why do they hate the house so much?" George stroked her hair, choosing his words carefully. "They don't hate it, Lily. They just don't understand it. People fear what they can't measure in money. To them it looks old, fragile, useless. But wood," he tapped the railing beside him, the grain worn smooth with time, "wood carries stories. Every mark, every knot, every creak means it's survived something. That's worth more than gold." Lily pressed her small hand flat against the rail, her eyes wide. "So the house remembers." "Yes," George said softly. "It remembers your great-grandfather's hands. It remembers your grandmother's cooking. It remembers my laughter when I was your age. And one day it will remember you." She smiled faintly, leaning her cheek against the grain. "I like that." George kissed the top of her head. "Never let anyone tell you that old means worthless. The world will laugh sometimes, the way your mother did tonight. But remember, what bends doesn't always break. What looks fragile can hold the most weight." The wind sighed through the pines, as though echoing his words. Lily closed her eyes, comforted by the rhythm of the house breathing around them. Inside, on the table, the folder still lay where George had placed it, the deed resting like a quiet guardian of the future. He didn't need to wave it in anyone's face anymore. Its power was not in shocking Samantha or silencing Michael. Its power was in knowing it would endure until Lily was ready to carry it. George held his granddaughter closer, whispering one last truth. "Respect, my dear, is like this wood, stronger with time. Remember that and you'll always know who you are." And that, friends, is the story of George Walker and the wooden house on Timber Lane. A reminder that sometimes the things mocked as relics are the very things that hold us together. Quiet justice doesn't always roar, it simply waits. And when the moment comes, it speaks louder than laughter. Thank you for listening to this story here on Family Shadows. If it touched you, please consider subscribing, sharing, or leaving a kind word in the comments. From our family to yours, may your home stand strong, may your memories be honored, and may your hearts be filled with health, peace, and happiness. Blessings to you and your family. Until next time, Herb.